Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Now, this week's episode is a bit different because we're actually responding to a listener's question, but more about that in a moment. My name is Julia Golding, and I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Fantasy and also a full-time writer. I sort of juggle the two roles. And today I am joined by a friend of the Oxford Centre, that is Jacob Rennaker. Now, Jacob is well known to us as a Tolkien scholar, but he also has had a little job shift since we last spoke. So perhaps, Jacob, you'd like to introduce in brief your new role, because it's very fascinating from a
Yes.
fantasy viewpoint.
Yeah, so I'm working for Ravensburger that does publishing in children's books, games, puzzles, and whatnot. And a lot of what they deal with, if you've seen the Villainous board game, they have like Disney Villainous, Marvel Villainous, and forthcoming Star Wars Villainous. They have some games. They have a forthcoming actual Lord of the Rings puzzle book game that is tremendous. There's some serious care that's been put into making this. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I think it's been announced publicly. If not, hopefully they're not listening. But there's something for this particular group to look forward to coming to stores near you sometime within the next year.
Yeah, that
Less
actually
than a
that
year.
suggests another theme for us one day, which is about these crossover products. Because of course it's
Mm.
famous that Star Wars, for example, made a fortune from its toy version. So this sort of world where it comes out of a film or a book or whatever and becomes like a whole world and cosplay and all the rest of it is fascinating. Anyway, so what was the question we were asked, and why have I brought Jacob back? Well, we got this rather cryptic message from a reader saying, what about the stone giants in The Hobbit? They're really wild. And I thought about that for a moment. I thought, yes, you are absolutely right. What about the stone giants? So if you haven't read The Hobbit for a while, they don't really impinge on the story very much. There is a sequence in the Peter Jackson film, which goes on for quite some time, with the sort of mountain rock people taking shape and then throwing stones at each other, and the Hobbit and the dwarves are all sort of at risk. But actually, where do they come from? I went back to the book just to check, and it literally says, "Oh, watch out! There are the stone giants. They're bad news. They're throwing rocks." No sort of sense of where their backstory is. So, Jacob, do you have a theory where the stone giants actually come from?
Yeah, that's funny. So I did some after. Thank you, dear listener, whomever you are, for that question. So that got me poking around, and yeah. So with The Hobbit, it's interesting, like you said, that they only kind of mentioned there as kind of a backdrop, right? That that they're mentioned in kind of the same breath as this really evocative imagery of two storms clashing,
Mm,
and so they kind of seem to be almost equated, synonymous with these kind of elemental, grand, uh, almost cosmic forces, or world-bound cosmic forces, and they don't appear again. There's other in the Hobbit itself. There's a few other passing references to giants that aren't stone giants, right? So this kind of the descriptor of stone in stone giants just only appears here. And I think I couldn't find anywhere else in Legendarium where stone giants were singled out, but giants here in within the Hobbit itself, you have passing references to giants, like Bilbo wonders if this giant boulder that he sees in a stream was maybe thrown there by a giant at some point,
mm,
but nothing is kind of fleshed out there. And Bladorthan says that he'd like to find a more or less decent giant. So there's kind of a moral dimension. There's decent versus indecent, I guess, giants. But largely these stone giants kind of seem indifferent, right? They're so massive in scale. They're not concerned with, they don't seem to notice Bilbo and company. And even if they did, who knows if they would care about these little, kind of minuscule creatures. So it's so you do, I know, and then this is, and we can go into this perhaps a little bit later. I'll wait for you to lead on this in Lord of the Rings, the idea of giants and how that kind of develops over the development of Lord of the Rings specifically as a story, but within the world of the Hobbit, this is kind of a almost a flash in the pan. You just kind of see this as a backdrop for this kind of adventure setting, with, like you said, that they don't play a significant role in the story, the development of the story, rather than to provide some sort of larger backdrop for the adventure against which the adventure is happening. Yeah.
I mean, they have the plot point of driving the Hobbit and the dwarves underground. I mean, that's what the purpose they serve is, to escape from these elemental creatures. They then get tangled up with the goblins. So you can see, you need an exciting turn in the journey to drive the dwarves somewhere they don't want to go. But I suppose there's also an association here, as you mentioned, with the storms of the elements. And it made me sort of connect it with the later iteration of a sort of sentient mountain. Because in the Lord of the Rings, they have, or in the Fellowship of the Ring, they have the passage up Cadras, which is abortive because of the attack of the weather, which seems like a return in snow to the idea that somehow the elements can, in a neutral, not exactly neutral, but in a way that isn't involved in the battles of elves and men, can turn against travelers. And there seems to be some sort of correspondence there.
Yeah,
but I think just looking at their presence in The Hobbit, I mean, The Hobbit is a less tidy book in terms of the legendarium than The Lord of the Rings. So, for example, there is like the random reference to, is it Smaug dying like a screech of a steam train? It has a more storytelling awareness of our world element to it. And it has a more nursery feel. So it could be that there are elements that are just chucked into it to excite the reader, which don't have so much of a backstory. But I do remember reading that Tolkien thought he only had one reference in all of it, which he hadn't actually sort of plugged in properly, and that was the reference about the Queen and her cats that comes in Lord of the Rings somewhere. I think Aragorn mentions a past queen, and no doubt Tolkien went back and worked out what that meant. But I seem to remember him saying that was the only thing that wasn't connected. So maybe there are connections with the giants that we are missing. So let's dig a little bit more. So let's think about the giant, that figure in sort of world myth, before we come back to Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and people. So thinking back to the sources of giants, I came up with two main sources which I felt influenced Tolkien and also C.S. Lewis, and that was the Greek version and the Viking version. I don't know, which one do you feel you want to address first? Have at one of them.
Maybe so. So do either one. I went on a kind of deep dive into Norse.
Okay, let's
earlier, just kind of went down the Norse rabbit hole. But the Greek, Greek is easy. I think there are a lot of similarities, right, between Greek and Norse mythology in terms of giants and kind of the primordial nature, right? So, do you want? So Greek, I think Greek would probably take a little less time. Do you want to do Greek first?
Let's do Greek. Let's go Greek.
Greek, okay.
Cue music. Yeah.
So you have the Greek giants are children of Gaia and Uranus, and depending on which kind of founding mythology you're reading, they're either coming from when Uranus was castrated, right? They kind of bubble up from the blood from Uranus from that, or they're natural born to Uranus and Gaia, depending. So, some of the most massive, largest elemental figures, they're there, even side by side with the gods, or in some cases, seem to be in a grander scale in some sense, but they're largely right, strong, aggressive, and you have ultimately a kind of battle for power between the Olympian gods, the Gigantomachy, which right, this massive battle between the Olympians and the giants, and the Olympians end up winning. And there's
So
sometimes
are these giants the same as titans?
no, this is a different, yeah,
No?
so
Okay,
separate
let's clear that one
because
out of the way.
giants, yeah. So giants, so these giants, um, in right in Greek literature, broadly speaking, and this is terribly reductive, but giants can be large, but also they don't have to be. So some people that are referenced as giants aren't necessarily giant size wise, uh, and in some instances appear to be kind of like mythical, kind of like half like some sort of divine mythical creatures, but not necessarily like 40 feet 50 feet tall. They could be smaller. So but that's in kind of like the later literature and how they're dealing with quote giant. So I think typically I think of like the cyclops in say like the Odyssey, as that's kind of what I picture as kind of being a giant. But they're of course like slightly separate, related, but I think slightly separate stream. It all gets muddled and muddied when you're looking at all the literature together as a whole, right? Because each of these authors is kind of taking a different piece of this and running with it. So yeah, so largely though, I think when you're talking about the earlier giants, the earliest giants that are battling the Olympians, and shortly thereafter, they're just kind of like brutes, and almost seem to carry this kind of symbolic weight of chaos, right? So the Olympians are these gods that are bringing in, reason, rationale, order to chaos, disorder, barbarism, right? And so that's kind of how sometimes it's used with later authors referring to this story of the Olympian gods versus the giants as kind of, in essence, representing this greater idea of civilization versus barbarism. Or Plato even references this as the giants kind of representing base materialism, or like materialistic ways of looking at the universe, whereas Plato of course is the correct way of looking at it, which is more abstract, right, looking at some sort of transcendent realm, and that's where the Greek gods are representing. So in at least in Greek literature, it's kind of the idea, the images are kind of abstracted and kind of taken to symbolize a battle between order versus chaos, civilization, barbarism, reason, rationale, and just kind of base materialism, in some. So that's kind of the Greek,
Yeah.
largely kind of why I see when I read it.
So, and obviously, the Inkling authors all raised on Greek stories in the schooling system of the day, and I think one of the carry forwards there, which I can see, is the sense of them not being the sharpest of creatures, and I think that's particularly you can see that in C.S. Lewis's giants. He has a number of giants, some of whom are more benign than others, but that seems to me that he may be drawing on more of a Greek tradition. So let's do the Norse, where I suspect I can imagine Tolkien's fingerprints are slightly more visible.
Right.
I do remember that from the very foundational myths of Norse mythology, the physical world is made from the body of a giant.
Right.
So it
Correct.
is
Yeah. So
definitely that
that's yeah. So
that which has gone
Midgard.
before. Mm.
Right. Yeah. Which you have these overlaps, really interesting parallels in Mesopotamian mythology with the creation, with the Babylonians specifically, creation myth. But in Norse, you have right. So yeah, Ymir. Please, somebody's going to. I daren't. I'm
Apologies to those who can pronounce
apologies
these
to
properly. Yeah.
anyone who does, to everyone who does Norse in any of its incarnations. But right, so this kind of primeval giant is the first being that actually exists in the world, right? That's kind of formed from drops of water when the ice of Niflheim meets the heat of Muspelheim. So you have, again, apologies for pronunciation, but so it's kind of in the middle of the, extra hot, extra cold, in the middle where that meets the watery area this giant kind of just develops out of. So, and then from his person or its person kind of develops, kind of grows other giants. So that's what you have that happening. And kind of at the same time, elsewhere, meanwhile, you have the original gods being created as well. So they're kind of two different tracks of kind of origins for the gods like Odin, etc. We would think of more traditional gods, Thor, etc. And then the giants that are kind of born directly from the body of this initial being that is the first to exist in this world. So yes,
and
there you have.
They battle it out, don't they? Those gods and the giants.
Right. Well, they're battling it out, and the gods that are the more kind of like human-like gods end up, slaying this primeval giant, and his blood drowns all of the other giants except for one family that survives on a little boat, and then survives. And it's the fashioning, the gods fashion the world from this deceased god's body and set up from the brow of this this primeval god, Midgard, right, which literally is Middle Earth, and it is meant to protect in some ways the inhabitants of Midgard from these giants who they're trying to push off to the periphery.
Okay, so we've got a wide range of giants there, and just thinking about the sort of trickle down effect when we look into the sort of world of medieval stories, another fascination for Tolkien and Lewis in particular. You get versions of these giants in new forms coming forward. And I think the one that obviously we know is a direct influence is Gawain in the Green Knight. The Green Knight is a giant, but he is a giant in the sense of the stature of one of the Greek ones. He's not that huge, but he's not dim. He's elemental. He's clever. He's a force of nature. He's magic. He's scheming. So he's an absolutely fascinating figure, I think, as a sort of interpretation of the giant as the other that threatens the world of the court and the knight civilization. But he's offering a different kind of civilization in his green chapel. So I think that's a really fascinating giant, and probably my favorite of all the giants, because he seems to have so many aspects to him.
Yeah, agreed. No, that's and then the Gawain and the Green Knight is a fascinating story in and of itself, right? And when we know of course that Tolkien specifically, there's actually a letter of Tolkien that's up for auction right now for anybody who's it's currently it's there. You can get it right now. It's at over $6,000 right now. But it's a letter to a fan who's writing about Lord of the Rings, hadn't quite finished reading it, but what they had read had impressed them so much. They wrote a letter, Tolkien wrote a letter back, and he says that he's talking about the creation of Middle Earth, and he says, naturally in digested form, I am indebted to the myths and legends of literature, but most especially to those of England and Wales. For Gaelic of Ireland and Scotland, I have a great liking. So I think, so definitely looking at Gawain and the Green Knight, there's a special place in Tolkien's heart for this kind of Celtic, Gaelic version of giants as it come there. And I think that's a valuable insight into, and especially the do we have the Green Knight and some interesting connections to giants and ents in Lord of the Rings. So
hold the thought about ents, because you made a very interesting point about the actual meaning of the word ent. We need to properly recognize the Mabinogion and the Irish legends. Again, Giant's Causeway. That's for those of you who aren't familiar with the sort of geography of Northern Ireland, there's a fantastic World Heritage Site called the Giant's Causeway, which is created by cooling basalt from an ancient volcano. And it's called the Giant's Causeway because it looks as though it's been made by a creature, a giant. And it links up geologically to Fingal's Cave over in Scotland. So there's a huge presence of giants in the landscape that is all over England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and giants cut into chalk surfaces, you know, everywhere, and any large structure is often named after a giant or a hero who is treated like a giant. So heroic people of that stature. So there's a very rich tradition there, and all of these masses of influences are all going into what Tolkien called the cauldron of story and being stirred around. So let's look at the specific mention of Ent, because this word isn't actually Tolkien's word, is it?
No, no, it's right. It's the Old English, often translated as giant itself. So Ent and giant in Old English appear to be synonymous or have a close affinity to each other. So it's really interesting looking at how, you know, the development of Lord of the Rings, the different drafts, that in early drafts you have references to giants, not frequently, right? So it seems that after The Hobbit, as he's putting together Lord of the Rings, you still have some references to giants, but upon successive revisions, they kind of get weeded out. And even Treebeard himself, right? So this idea of Ents, Treebeard in earlier drafts is described more or less like a giant who's kind of dressed in green or wearing, you know, mail that looks like leaves, and he has a beard, you know, like branches, but and then is described as having his own court with, you know, some sort of courtly retinue, right? Who stand tall, who stand like young trees. So again, this is saying that they're standing like them, not so there's some ambiguity there. Are they actually trees? But then as it kind of develops, it seems like Tolkien is taking, you know, what was happening in what he was doing with the idea of giants, this kind of, you know, generic idea of giants as these large oafish creatures that you really get a better sense for in the Farmer Giles of Ham. The giant there for Tolkien is kind of this explicit, you know, just dumb brute who's deaf and partially blind and just kind of bumbling, to then, and these passing references in Hobbit that seem to be connecting it to this wider world of children's, you know, stories about giants and knights battling giants and that sort of thing. He then kind of takes that and it seems like he's trying to make it his own, giving his own personal kind of internally consistent idea of giants. And it seems, at least in my reading of kind of all this, you know, preparatory material and multiple drafts, that he's kind of taking this idea of giants and developing that within the legendarium into Ents in some way. One aspect of giants kind of evolves into Ents.
Okay, so here's a theory, Jacob.
Yeah.
If in The Hobbit we've got stone giants, hyphenated stone giants,
Yeah.
maybe what we've got in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, is wood giants.
Yeah.
So you can imagine there's a sense of he's working through the elements here, because it's a very elemental landscape that we're moving in. So
right.
perhaps that's where we're going here with it.
You could, because you do have in, you know, Book of Lost Tales, there's references to you know, Melko breeding giants in the earth along with other monsters, with the wicked dwarves, ogres, but that doesn't really he doesn't follow that trajectory, it seems. So we have giants mentioned in some of that earlier material, but it doesn't seem to survive as he's kind of working and reworking it. That he really seems fascinated with, like you're saying, that kind of dimension of giants, the elemental giants that are, you know, kind of the green, the wood, and follows those and develops that, because he says, you know, that he doesn't remember creating Treebeard, and so this is something that kind of seems to be happening kind of organically, for lack of a better term, right?
Growing from a
As he's
seed.
right. But he didn't see, Tolkien didn't see himself as kind of like from whole cloth, kind of creating consciously this entity that is Treebeard as an ent, but then it kind of just kind of grows into this idea, which is which I find fascinating, because it is so directly tied to the landscape itself, right? That Tolkien was so particular about, and he writes, so movingly about, just in describing. He obviously cared about, right, trees, landscape, the world, and the ents kind of become this vehicle for personifying, giving a voice to the land, right, to nature. And that's it kind of grows, and then it becomes something that's distinct, that we see, like you were mentioning with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that we see the Green Knight kind of having a tie to the green, right, the elements of wood, kind of in particular. And so this is, I think, him perhaps, Tolkien leaning a bit, being drawing a bit from that, but then kind of amplifying it 100-fold in his own the petri dish that is Middle Earth and the broader, right, legendarium.
I'm getting a bit carried away with my theory here, but I got another one to offer you.
Okay, keep going. I love it.
Yeah, so we've got stone giants and wood giants. The Balrog is arguably a fire giant, because it's described as a sort of spirit of flame, isn't it? And
Right.
it's it's one of those sort of elemental monsters created by the original Melkor Dark Lord, the super baddie. So where we've got that's earth, fire, and wood. We're doing quite well on our elements here.
Right, you can throw in the eagles if you want to do. You want to do eagles? You can go ahead and do that if you want, for
okay.
for a looser connection too, right? So the air, right, that they're right in their manways, kind of the specific, affinity for manway, who's largely in charge of, right, the kind of the realm of air. So I think that works. I think you're onto something.
That's the next academic article. Not that I write those anymore. So I think what's really interesting is that in some ways, another argument here is that everything but hobbits are giants in Lord of the Rings, because our perspective, our point of view is of the small. So it means actually that the way it's positioned is that that we are going out into a bigger world, a world that doesn't care or understand the halfling, the hobbit. So even the men that we meet are a bit like giants to the hobbits. I mean, you see that obviously in the film with all the discussion about how they did the false perspective and the doubling to make this clear. But you've got the sort of oafish giant people in Bree, and then you've got the sort of regal giants of the sort of Gondor people and people of stature and the elves. So you could say that there's this theme of perspective that runs all the way through Lord of the Rings, which reminds me very much of another literary antecedent, which is perhaps one of the first to make real use of this perspective, and that's called Gulliver's Travels, which has the two worlds where Gulliver in one place is a tiny, and in another place he's the giant. So it feels a bit like that to me, that Tolkien's very aware of just how big or small you are in a fantasy world, because that's really the heart of being a giant, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. You do. Yeah. Absolutely. And then you have nuance added kind of to that, or kind of taken in different directions. And I think, and that's where, the giants kind of being used as metaphor. You see that in some ways I think here in Lord of the Rings, definitely, but also in the Chronicles of Narnia, and some of C.S. Lewis's other writings, where the idea of giant as metaphor for something different, and even into sometimes contemporary literature, which we can talk about shortly.
Yeah, let's turn to Narnia. So just off the top of my head, I could think of, there may be more, I could think of three giants. There's the first one that we meet in Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, who is turned to stone, previously, and his giant Rumblebuffin, quite a cozy name, and he's the one who borrows the handkerchief to mop his brow. That's all, and he's obviously in the tradition of gentle but bit dim giants. Then the next one I could think of was the one who stands as a marshal in the fight between Peter and Miraz. And he is Wimblefeather, who seems a close cousin or descendant of the one from Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And then the most interesting giants, and the ones that connect most to the stone giants of the Hobbit, are the ones that pop up in the Silver Chair. There's a lot of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in this as well, with the wintry setting and the Christmas feast and all of this. But there is, when they're first introduced, they are behaving very much like the giants from the Hobbit, because we actually get the giants throwing stones. And Jill, who's called Scrub, says, "Are they aiming at us?" No, said Puddleglum. "We'd be a good deal safer if they were."
Right.
So these giants
terrible
are
shots.
Terrible aim, terrible shots, duffers in the sporting world of Narnia. But then, of course, the children then go into the castle where they're treated as guests, but it turns out a bit like a Jack and the Beanstalk sort of scenario, very much that kind of fairy tale feel, where they realize that they are the prime dish, not the guests for dinner. They are dinner. So that world to me seems as though C.S. Lewis is drawing on fairy tale giants, really. But the stupidity, the silliness comes from a sort of easily tricked element, comes from the sort of the Cyclops type giant. So there's sort of a bit of Greek in there as well. Have I mentioned them all? Have I missed a giant?
There's so Rumblebuffin, Wimbleweather, Stonefoot is another one that's mentioned by name. But there seems to be, and this is interesting, right? Because C.S. Lewis isn't as meticulous in his world building as Tolkien is, right? No. And so he just kind of jams everything in there. But like that's part of his methodology, is being open to, right, the gathering in of kind of a number of different myths and kind of putting them all together in a little kind of playpen to have fun with, and to saying that all of that is imbued, that all of these are essentially kind of coming from the same great capital M myth when it comes to it. So he felt free to just kind of pull from everywhere, right, and to keep those explicitly distinct in their original forms. But what Lewis, I don't know if he's intentionally or unintentionally, he almost sets up a few different kind of categories of giants, right? So you have the Narnian giants, who are the ones that seem to be like native to and live in Narnia, are kind, generally speaking, but just not very bright. But you have a few rogue giants that are part of the witch's army in that initial fight, and right that we have between those groups in Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. But then once you get into Silver Chair, which is going north, then you have those the Etinsmore, the Etin, these large, they're huge. They seem to be unintelligent, violent, terrible aim, like you mentioned. But it's said they could have like additional heads and arms sometimes. They seem to be kind of more monstrous creatures. We're not told if they're speaking any sort of language, if they or speak Narnian, something else, or nothing at all. Whereas when you get to Harfang, those giants appear to be kind of smaller in scale. Certainly, they seem different because they have a government system, a social structure, hierarchy, and they're not as massive. At least,
and they have cookbooks.
Right. They have cookbooks, so clearly they're civilized. Yeah, they're civilized. they have cookbooks, and so they're so you have kind of. So I don't know if these are social distinctions between giants, or if they're biological distinctions. These are different trajectories. But what's happening in Harfang, Harfanger is clearly kind of different from what's happening on Eddon's Moor, you know, when they're running from those giants. So they're a little bit smaller, more civilized, and they're devious, right? So they're intelligent, and you get kind of the wily, like you were mentioning, Julia, with the Green Knight, where he's not a giant in the sense of the kind of oafish, bumbling, just large size, is kind of size and strength being its largest defining feature, but rather he's kind of this blend of cunning, right, and of intelligence, sometimes hyper intelligence in the way that they're strategizing, and you do have that more with the giants specifically that are in that castle there, Castle Harfang. So you have those, but then you have Father Time that they see sleeping underground there in Silverchair. So I'd love to hear, your thoughts on Father Time there, and what you think is happening there in terms of him being referenced as a giant, and what if there's shifting, or what you think Lewis is doing with that.
Yeah, so that's the kind of giant you don't want to wake up, because he is woken up, isn't he, in the last battle, and that's the end of time, and that reminds me of some of the more folkloric giants. It's later, but there's a fantastic book called The Giant Under the Snow, a children's book by, I think it's John Gordon, which has this idea of there is a giant. They looked at the old earthworks, the sort of Iron Age earthworks, and thought this looks like human, a shape. And so the idea of if you rouse the sleeping giant, you cause the end of an age or some sort of cataclysm. And I think that's what's going on there, the sense of it's like the world started with the Norse god who was turned into the world. Well, it sort of ends with one as well. Calling time, literally calling time. So I feel that that's a sort of folkloric northern giant creeping into the world of Narnia there.
Yeah, that's the Father Time was fascinating. So when I first read Silverchair, that's what, like, I stopped on that. Sometimes there's certain ideas that you just kind of have to like stop and chew on for a minute before you kind of keep going. But then this idea of Father Time personified, and that he'd once as the children are asking who is this, what is that, and then you get this kind of quick snapshot of a backstory where he ruled a kingdom somewhere in early Narnia, and then eventually kind of sank down into the underland and put to sleep, and you have all these birds and bats and dragons and lizards there, but he's clearly massive and held in respect, which you don't have that sort of respect. I think does it describe it almost as like a chapel that he's kind of sleeping within. The room is there seems to be some sort of care that's given to him as an individual, this kind of Father Time. And so that that arrested me at first, and then when that same character comes back in the last battle, just all of those sections I had to kind of keep reread each of those, just the description of him. So he's clearly different, in a different category from these other giants. Right, it says his description in last battle, his face was not like a giant's, but noble and beautiful, right? So the assumption is that giants are ugly, right, or hideous creatures, but this one wasn't, right? He's noble. He's got this huge snowy beard, and then a pure silver light rested upon him, though no one could see where it came from. So he's kind of illuminated from some unknown source. He's kind of this sense of kind of, I want to say holiness, but certainly it's kind of like a mythic weight to him, even in the way he's lit. It kind of sets him apart, and he ends up, like you were saying, it's a really fascinating parallel between the Norse myths, where the world is created from the body of this giant, and then here it's this giant that ultimately ends Narnia, right, in that particular world, by squeezing the sun like an orange, and brings an end to that. And presumably, right, he dies outside, he's left outside of the world as it dies, but then presumably he's kind of brought into the other the true Narnia. Well,
yes, but he also represents the physical property of time, doesn't he? So that the world that they go into in the last battle is a place outside of time. It's eternity.
Yeah. So the
So
question
I
is, yeah.
wonder,
So
I
we
mean,
don't.
this is where we get into the philosophy of it. And also it reminded me that, of course, of the biblical roots of giants and the idea of huge creatures that are sort of, as in the book of Daniel, there are lots of very large, I wouldn't call them traditional giants, but large prophetic creatures that are sort of instruments of God's power. So I feel that Father Time feels like a kind of instrument of Aslan's power in that world in a more almost biblical way, that sort of fits with the Revelation film feel of that last book.
That's really interesting because you do have, right, in Daniel, this figure seen in vision that, different parts of, clay and, iron and, right, the different types of metals all representing successive kingdoms. And so that is, so it's this person is a personification of time. And perhaps, that you have it, because Lewis is playing so fast and loose. And I think that's the fun of Lewis, is that this creature could be an actual moving creature that can squish a sun in its hand, in its massive hand, but also can serve as the embodiment of time itself, of linear time itself. And so there's kind of this interplay that is very mythic, right? So he's writing in that mode where, you can be both and it's not necessarily one specific creature, but it's playing with ideas as well as kind of with like more concrete realities. And you see this, and where I saw this when I was thinking about giants in Lewis outside of Narnia, thinking about the Great Divorce and that surreal kind of closing chapter where the narrator sees these giant creatures, specifically, right, a great assembly of gigantic forms that are around these, like, it looks like a chessboard, and they're moving these little pieces on the chessboard. And what the narrator is told, talking with George MacDonald, right, as his kind of psychopomp spirit guide, is that the people, these gigantic figures, are actually human souls, right? They're the spirits, they're the lived reality, and that these kind of tiny pawns are the kind of physical manifestations of people, so that each person is so much larger and grander and is part of something larger outside of time, and that this board that's representing time, these people, these tiny small figures are just kind of being moved about, that's a separate realm, and the experience that those people are involved with is different from the kind of transcendent reality outside of that kind of plane of time. So I absolutely agree with you there.
I'm now going to earn some bonus points here, because what you've just said reminds me of The Place of the Lion, the fascinating Charles Williams novel, which has the idea of the Platonic archetypes, which are gigantic versions of. So a lion is the essence of lion, a huge lion, and the butterfly is the essence of butterflies and beauty, which sucks everything. It sort of threatens the world. These giant creatures, a giant snake as well, they threaten our reality by sucking everything into them. That's the sort of the dilemma of that fascinating novel. So there seems to be a philosophical level here, which the giant form is working on in both Lewis and Charles Williams, which I think I'm going to have to think about a bit more, but there seems to be a connection. Certainly the sort of the idea of ending, having the power to end reality, seems to be quite a strong correlation there. Okay, so we've done quite a deep dive into giants in Tolkien, giants in C.S. Lewis, dip into Charles Williams. Where do we think giants have gone now? We've seen them in Sir Gawain in the Green Knight. We've seen them in, and we can mention other Arthurian tales, just wave at them in passing. We've seen them in Gulliver's Travels. I'm trying to think if there's any connecting hopscotch we can do here. I mean, obviously there was fairy tales and the whole era of fairy tales that came along with Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen and others. But we have had an explosion of giants in contemporary culture, if we think about it. So have at the idea of the contemporary giant. I've got one big franchise in mind. Let's see if you come up
You're
with the
gonna do,
same
yeah.
one.
I'll leave the Wizarding World to you. Then is that the
Oh
one
no, I
you're
wasn't
alluding
going to
to?
do that, but well done. Let's do a
Okay,
quick.
that's all
tip.
right.
I completely forgotten that. Yes, let's do that. So we've got J.K. Rowling giants. Obviously, we've got Hagrid as our
Right,
favourite
who's
half
half giant, right?
Yeah, but we do have a connection here to the dim giants, don't we? The dim and vicious giants, because they do
Right.
tend to be on that end of the scale. With the honourable exception of the headmistress of Beauxbaton School, who
Right.
seems quite refined, but the others all seem quite persuaded by Voldemort.
Right. Yeah. That they're dull. Right. Yeah. That Grop, Hagrid's half brother, that's full giant, is clearly dim. And with that, you see, and so kind of how giants, come back to our point about how giants kind of can be used symbolically and sometimes morally, in a sense, as we saw with the Greek myths, giants kind of being used morally in a sense, or philosophically. You have a prejudice in the wizarding world against giants, where they're treated, as second class citizens. So there's kind of metaphor of being used, again, like the other, and our favorite, Maxime, the headmistress, when Hagrid is talking to her and confiding, like, it's finally nice to find somebody who is also, he kind of has the same heritage. She gets really upset and says, like, "Are you suggesting that I'm giant?"
How
In
dare you?
essence, right? So yeah. So is she, and this is something that I'm talking about this with my wife, who knows the Harry Potter books better than anyone I know. She was saying, was saying that in a sense, she seems to be trying to pass as non-giant. And so once she's kind of called out as having that heritage, so there's then she gets very upset. She's extra defensive about that. And so you have that almost giant kind of being used as a social metaphor for, social classes that are seen as, secondary citizens. And that comes across in how giants are spoken of by other people in the wizarding world. Cornelius Fudge, for instance. So anyway, so there's, so wizarding world, you have those ones. Other ones that I was thinking of, Neverending Story, Michael Ende, the rock biter. So kind of, I was thinking about that, especially in light of the, our listeners' reference to the stone giant, this literally giant made out of stone who eats rocks. And that creature, again, this like kind of more cosmic, massive, who dies, who's end up, we see fleeing from the end of reality, as we know it within this world, of the story of the titular never-ending story. So that's another one that came to mind as one that, especially in the film version of that, because I saw that film so many times when I was younger, that was kind of the quintessential massive cosmic giant, was Stone, the rock biter, from Neverending Story. So your turn.
Okay, I'm going to just do one more stone giant. My absolute favorite is in Galaxy Quest, which also happens to be possibly my favorite film. It's certainly my desert island film, because there is a literal rock giant, which is used for great comic effect, because the hero has to fight this stone giant and everyone's giving him advice, and he's basically saying, well, look, he's rock, what am I supposed to do? It's a very, very funny sequence, and it seems to go right back to the very origin of rocks that become a giant. Nice and simple, very funny, and has a great twist. I'm not going to spoil it for those who haven't watched it yet, but put it on your to watch list. Has a great twist in how it's used, in a brilliant way, as the plot unravels. Okay, no, the franchise I was going to suggest is the biggest, pun intended, of giant franchises, is the Transformer one. Because the Transformers, which also connect to toys and children's imagination and manipulation of vehicles, big trucks and things like that into robots, seem to me to be, they're huge. It always astounds me how the Transformer movies make so much money every time they come up, but there must be something incredibly appealing in that very concept of something mechanical that is sentient, and obviously got the good ones and the bad ones, but they can change and disguise themselves. But then you've got the problem of a big creature in a small space. So I think the one I watched most recently was the one that was called Bumblebee, which is one of the smaller of the Transformers. The fun is, most fun scene in that one is when the car kind of is inside the house trying to do things but doesn't have the fine motor skills, and everything just gets trashed. It's like the worst kind of teenage nightmare where the house is trashed while mum and dad are away. So the Transformers have a lot of fun with playing on a sort of technological giant.
That's good. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that when you mentioned that earlier, that Transformers as kind of a contemporary giant. But there's clearly, that there's something, not all children, I can't say that, but I know, with my own child, we have a 2-year-old, and he just gravitated towards big trucks and cars. We don't teach him. We're trying to raise him, on classical literature, and he's just like obsessed with garbage trucks. So it's hard to feel like I'm succeeding as a parent when they're, discarding, Alice in Wonderland for dump trucks. But it'll come. It'll come. But, right. But there's something. But I think there's something that, to children's minds, that's something that's large. And I think why perhaps one of the reasons why vehicles in particular is because they're moving, right? They seem to be moving. They seem to be living in some way, shape, or form that the child can't understand, right? They're not people, but they're large and they're moving around. And so there's something to be fascinated with, perhaps, terrified and fascinated with at the same time. But then giving those a greater personification in the Transformers, which again was one of my childhood. That's what I was raised on, was Transformer cartoons and toys, and that was my world. And so thinking about that as that they become more anthropomorphic with the toys themselves, and the creatures, because it's easier to relate to something that has a head and arms and legs than it is to a 4-wheeled vehicle, right? So I think that's one of the things, you're right, that like maybe tapping into something deeper with children that they're fascinated with, that could account for the success of Transformers. So bravo for thinking in that in that direction.
Well, you also, I feel like we're playing pinball and just little ideas are sort of flashing up with extra bonus points here, because you just mentioned Alice in Wonderland, and I was saying, oh, what happens about perspective?
Right.
And of course, Alice does this. She grows and she shrinks, and she spends part of Alice in Wonderland being too big, and that's a problem, and she has to get small again. That is another, I suppose that's feels like the Gulliver Travels experience brought forward into a famous, really the granddad of fantasy literature here in Oxford. So a little wave to Alice in Wonderland as we go past. But we would be remiss of us if we didn't mention the sort of DC and Marvel universe of all of this. Right. The one that I immediately thought of was the Hulk. Because obviously that is a transformational thing of a human, sort of relatively weedy, no, not really weedy, but a sort of normal man who then becomes this enormous giant. And that's the giant fueled with rage. And it sort of clues into that idea of it's a primal side of us that is released. The kind of Mr. Hyde version of us when we spend most of our life as Dr. Jekyll. So that seems to be a connection to those primal giants we mentioned. Though, of course, what they've done with him since in things like Thor Ragnarok, they're always changing in these comic series. So it's a moving target we're talking about.
Right. And that's one thing I think is fascinating with the Hulk in particular is starts out as, yeah, like you're saying, this dimension of humanity that's just kind of the brutish, um, unintelligent, speaking, monosyllabic creature. And whereas then you have in the movies, you have, right, this kind of fusing of the intelligence, hyper intelligence of the scientist that the Hulk grows into to become his charmingly brutish, large green self. But in the comics, you have different versions, right? So you have this green Hulk, and then you have a second iteration that's this gray Hulk, where he has the Hulk size and strength, but retains the intellect of the scientist. So he's this hyper intelligent, massive creature, and that's kind of what they're kind of melding those traditions in the comic together in the films, where in the contemporary present day Marvel timeline, you have this hyper intelligent, large, hulking creature. So Hulk is a great example, I think, of playing with different dimensions of the giant trope. You also have that with the Thing of the Fantastic Four in Marvel, looking at Marvel
Yeah.
specifically,
Rock
who's
giant,
this
another name
he's
change for a
brutish,
rock giant. Yes. He's
right?
got
Right,
stony
he's
skin,
rockish.
isn't he?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So so good, another connection to rock related elemental kind of creatures. But he's still his intelligence, because he's a originally a football kind of beefy athlete, college athlete, who then develops this super strength and super rocky skin. So you have and you also have bringing in both the comic books and the films, Ant-Man, right? So is dealing with size. So
Yeah.
again, when you mentioned Alice in Wonderland, the growing and shrinking, you have that same sort of trope in Ant-Man, where he can change his size, right? This is one of perspective. So he's tiny, can go inside individual molecules, inside human bodies, but then also can can become you know 10 stories tall, 20 stories tall, and completely massive. And it's one of perspective and size. So you have the superhero who is originally kind of as Ant-Man in the comics becomes Goliath, because he kind of reverses the process for becoming small, and then it lives as a giant for a while, and then you have that variance of size and perspective. And it seems like Marvel, compared to DC, is paying greater attention to those large scale issues of skin size with heroes. There aren't, most of the giants in DC are lesser known characters, not any of the kind of headliners, like you can say with Marvel, with Hulk and Thing, and Ant-Man slash Goliath, who he is in the comics, at least when he's huge. But you have Giganta, who's this giant woman, Atom Smasher, Anti-Monitor, but they kind of like B, at the risk of offending fictional characters, they seem like B and C list superheroes and supervillains that get the giant card, who draw that in their kind of creation. But one of the things that I did that kind of connects us back to, I feel, kind of thematically, to Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien in particular, is DC's Swamp Thing, who is a creature that's made out of vegetation, right? Who's this kind of embodiment of who originally was kind of this horror creature, who is a human that became a walking tree, walking plant creature. But then in the comics themselves, he becomes this kind of avatar for the world of vegetation and trees, right? The green itself is this realm that he kind of inhabits, and he's kind of the go-between between the natural world and the world of humans. And this creature, he can change sizes as well. Sometimes he can be massive. There's one spot where he actually visits Gotham City to rescue someone, and he swells in size to dwarf the buildings beneath him, but also can be smaller. It's variable because he's a plant at heart, but I think it's very similar to the Treebeard, right? As this kind of avatar, in a sense, a spokes tree. Is that the right word? A spokes tree for
I think we'll
the
go, yeah,
natural world,
spoke
and kind of the
scent.
go between. a go-between between the world of humans, right? When we're talking with Merry and Pippin, Treebeard is kind of the, you know, our go-between, our psychopomp, if you will, helping them in some ways understand what's at stake for the natural world in these larger battles that are happening. That's what I think is that you see that happening more thematically in DC with the Swamp Thing character, and that the Parliament of Trees that functions with its own mythology. But that it's more evocative to me of Tolkien and what he was doing with the giant tree figures than anything else.
I bet a number of people listening to this are shouting Groot, Groot, because there's another
Right.
character who seems very Entish. So it's impossible, obviously, to mention everybody's favorite giant, but I think we should just do a quick nod to the sort of Roald Dahl world of giants, the big friendly giant, and that world where you've got giants as quite benign figures. So it's the picture books, for example, which my children, the one about George the giant who gives away his clothes. I don't know if you know that story. It's a wonderful. So he starts off finely dressed and gradually he's the kindest giant and he gives away his clothes and he's able to clothe an entire village as a result. So there are those sorts of sweet, benign giants as well, which may be a nice place to sort of to end after having seen some horrors on our journey. So we always have a where in all the worlds. And the obvious question, Jacob, is which fantasy world is it best to be one of these giants? By the way, I also noticed there's a definite lack of female giants. I mean, the Entwives are missing.
Right.
Most of the ones we mentioned are either sort of neutral sex or, I mean, to be fair, Lewis has a whole castle of mixed gender giants. Right. But on the whole, it seems to be a masculine place to be a giant, really. Anyway, where would you like to be a giant?
It seems like the place with the least amount of underlying prejudice against giants is Narnia. That seems to be the place that seems most accommodating or open to dealing with giants in at least a semi-civilized way. So if I was a giant, that's probably where I'd have to land.
Yeah,
I hate to say that because I want to come up with something better, but like, well, it just seems, for my sake, purely selfish, for purely kind of logistical reasons, Narnia seems like the only place I can think of.
I think I'll probably go quite old school. I think I'll go for the world of Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, because he does have a whole castle and a court and sort of mystic powers. So I think I'd quite like to be, and also you seem pretty eternal because you get your head cut off and you pop up again. So,
Right.
you know, I think that might be a good option. But on the whole, I think fantasy worlds are pretty rough on giants.
Yeah, they don't seem, so they're typically, right. So you rarely, I can't really think of many where you have giants held up as symbols of virtue, nobility, right? That they're true
in Pilgrim's
protagonists.
Progress, in Pilgrim's Progress, it's the giant of despair. I mean, they really get a poor billing in that book too, and they get outwitted.
So maybe that's a challenge for. Yeah, no, exactly, and I think that'd be a challenge for those of our listeners who are also authors and storytellers to come up with a scenario. I would love to read a story that kind of turns that tendency and trope on its head of a heroic, a giant who is held up, whose virtues are held up in some way. It'd be hard to do, I think, just because of the kind of overwhelming cultural weight that's placed on giants. But I think that'd be worth seeing. I'd love to see it.
Okay, that's the challenge. That's the homework.
And a female giant, a female. So this would be a female giant who's held up as a symbol of virtue, nobility, honor.
I have actually done this in one of my books. I've written a couple of books called the Mel Foster series, and Mel Foster teams up with Eve Frankenstein, who is daughter of Frankenstein. They sort of have an almost graphic novel feel to it, these books. And she is the virtuous, she is the good guy in this. I only make her about 7 or 8 feet tall, so her logistical problems are not too big, because otherwise you spend all your time working out how you get someone in a building. But she was my attempt to both correct the gender imbalance and also give giants a better billing. So,
and I'm embarrassed that I haven't read that yet.
that's
So
okay.
I would
That's
say,
fine.
yeah. So plug that. Where can we find that?
You can find it
that book?
online, you know, in bookshops and online.
Wherever good.
Yeah, but that was my
Which of
attempt.
the books?
Anyway,
Yeah. What's the titles? Yeah. What are the titles of those? Just for
so
my
the
own.
first, the first one is called Mel Foster. Well, the series is the Mel Foster's Monsters. And the second one is very H.G. Wells inspired. It's Mel Foster and the Time Machine. So the first one is Mel Foster and the Demon Butler. That's it. First, because that's about an evil butler takes over Queen Victoria. And the second one is Mel Foster and the Time Machine. They have to struggle to remember. I've written over 60 novels, so I sometimes get my titles a bit muddled. But they don't all have giants. That one does.
Okay, good. We'll check it out.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And yeah, that was really fun. I think we covered the territory on giants, but I'm sure other people will have more suggestions about themes that we could tackle, and we'll happily return and have a go at something else. Because we didn't even touch on giant creatures, King Kong,
No.
Godzilla. I mean, there's a whole other world of fantasy creatures out there.